Hi there. Thanks for watching this. This is a paper that I delivered at an event organized by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the Fondation Mark Bloch in Berlin in February. And it was very much looking at the non-aligned movement in relation to internationalism, following a text that I'd written for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. So I'm gonna kind of read the paper, and we'll see where we get. There's been a renewed interest in recent years among scholars and activists in the non-aligned movement, a collaboration that began formally with a summit conference in Belgrade in 1961 as a kind of alter or prior globalization, an aspirant counter-hegemonic multilateralism. The partnership between Socialist Yugoslavia and states in what we now term the Global South both responded to and accelerated processes of decolonization, drew attention to the threat of nuclear war in a world dominated by two superpowers and two main blocs, and it helped to articulate a new international economic order. Crucially, it also campaigned tirelessly for much needed reform of the United Nations. At the same time, it was often torn apart by internal conflicts. It faced concerted opposition from the aligned states, and many of its ideas remained as little more than words on paper. Although it was conceived very much as a top-down, interstate initiative, it created a space for meaningful transnational exchanges in the realms of science, art and culture, architecture and industry, student exchange and so on, that continue to be relevant and have an impact today. The student and technical exchanges are a legacy that live on and play an important part in solidaristic grassroots responses to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers along the so-called Balkan route to this day. Although not exclusively by any means a socialist grouping, NAM indicated potential socialist development paths for newly decolonial states that were not based on Soviet or Chinese models. Through a contemporary lens, NAM can be seen as a prefigurative post-national configuration, an imagined network community both transgressing the spatial order of nation states, but also in many ways reproducing a nation-state logic as a sort of United Nations light. NAM in the 60s and particularly in the 1970s becomes a litmus test for the changing spatial and political contours of resistance by the colonized, albeit with many contradictions, silences, and erasures. Revisiting NAM's work during the Cold War in the context of discussions of the limits and possibilities of multilateralism is of much more than mere historical significance. As well as allowing for an understanding of prior globalizations and transnational cooperation otherwise, it offers a unique insight into economic, political, social, and cultural imaginaries that challenge the dominant order, reworked core periphery relations, and crucially, advocated for self-determination free of both colonial and neo-colonial governmentality. The leading role played in the movement by Socialist Yugoslavia offers an entree into the study of the interconnections between socialist and post-socialist and decolonial worlds, an emerging theme among scholars today, and into ways of achieving economic, political, social, and cultural rights for all. NAM's successes and failures offer a prism for exploring struggles for a just international order and form a useful backdrop to discussions of a renewed left internationalism. In this short intervention, I want to situate the founding of NAM in a particular historical moment before addressing its role in outlining an emancipatory economic order and its contribution to UN reform. My purpose is not so much to discuss lessons that can be learned, but as I put it in my recent text, to attempt a work of recovery, reframing, and remembering, a kind of conjunctural translation. It's a very humble plea for a renewed internationalist ethics and a politics of emancipatory solidarity, a technique of negotiation and a strategy of survival, in the words of the feminist scholar Rada Ivekovic, that makes things otherwise accessible. A more or less quasi-utopian understanding of what might have been and what might be possible again. So from Bandung to Belgrade, comparing and contrasting the Bandung Afro-Asian Conference of April 1955 with the Belgrade Summit of September 61 has preoccupied scholars for many years. Svetozar Rajak argues that the leading role taken by Tito's Yugoslavia in the non-aligned movement built on the spirit of Bandung, but also transformed it in at least two ways. And in a later paper, which I'll put on video soon, I question this a little bit, but Rajak argues that firstly, it made the whole movement more global, although we should remember that Yugoslavia and Cyprus were the only European member states, and few Latin American countries joined until the 1970s. Secondly, he argues it made it into more of a movement with demands, many of which remained constant, but was also attuned to changes in the global geopolitical order. Again, there's a caveat here because Yugoslavia, amongst others, resisted, arguably until it was already too late, demands from many member states to formalize and institutionalize the non-aligned movement. Yugoslavia was not represented in Bandung, of course, but President Tito was already engaged in extensive travels to African and Asian countries beginning in 1954. And there was the famous meeting in July 56 on the Croatian island of Brijuni between Tito, Egyptian President Nasser, and Indian Prime Minister Nehru. More extensive diplomatic activity resulted in a series of coordinated actions at the opening of the 15th General Assembly of the United Nations in New York in September 1960. Meetings between Tito, Nasser, and Nehru, joined by President Sukarno of Indonesia and Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, cemented the five as the so-called founding fathers of the non-aligned movement. Differences between them were largely put aside in the context of escalating tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the dismissive reaction of the two superpowers and their blocs to joint resolutions calling on the superpowers to resume talks as soon as possible. Nehru, a long-time advocate of non-alignment as a central feature of Indian foreign policy, finally became persuaded of the wider relevance of the stance in the context of a transnational alliance. Okay, Tito's speech, which I'm going to go into in some detail at the General Assembly on the 22nd of September 1960, sets out both the rationale for a movement of the non-aligned. I'll move myself so you can actually see Tito. And key elements of its future program. Tito begins by noting the large numbers of new UN member states, primarily from Africa, and urges that the United Nations will achieve real and complete universality in the near future through the attainment of independence by all the peoples now under colonial rule, as well as through the recognition of the right of the People's Republic of China to be represented in the UN. He suggests that in an international atmosphere which causes great concern, marked by a revival of the Cold War, I keep having to move myself. Let's go down there. The spirit and principles of the UN Charter and rights to sovereignty for all are more important than ever, and that attacks on these principles are likely to impair considerably the standing of the United Nations and the trust placed in it. Peace-loving peoples, he suggests, are convinced that the fate of the world in times of heightened uncertainty should not be left to the decisions of only a few states. He notes the failure of the Big Four Paris summit meeting with de Gaulle and Macmillan, as well as Eisenhower and Khrushchev in Paris, the breaking off of the Geneva disarmament talks, the failure to ban nuclear testing, the revival of militarism in the Federal Republic of Germany, the continuing war in Algeria, the conflict in Congo, and more. Echoing Edward Kardelje, a kind of theorist of Yugoslav socialist self-management and non-alignment, Tito argued, quotes, the process of the national, economic, political, and cultural emancipation of former colonies is a historical necessity, as the struggle against colonialism becomes entangled with East-West antagonisms, reaching its most dangerous denouement in the ruthless policy of racial discrimination and oppression by the government of South Africa. Underdevelopment must be tackled, he argues, through technical, financial, and economic assistance. And he puts forward Yugoslavia's own willingness to forego the assistance it has been receiving in favor of the new African countries, as long as this does not lead to a neglect of the problems facing Latin America and Asia. There you go. That's the quote. I'm one slide behind in everything. Sorry about that. He moves on to look at the need for general and complete disarmament before outlining principles of international relations based on peaceful and active coexistence, non-interference in the affairs of others, and the right of countries to choose their own social and economic systems. Coexistence cannot mean the freezing of the status quo, but must involve striving to make the principles embodied in the United Nations Charter into a reality. Concluding with a focus on the contribution that the so-called non-committed, they still hadn't used the phrase non-aligned by this point, the so-called non-committed countries can make towards the betterment of international relations, and to the greater role that the United Nations can and should play in this respect. The Belgrade Summit in September 1961 was an object lesson in what Jürgen Dinkel and others have called performative summitry, with the Yugoslavs keen to present Belgrade as a modern capital, welcoming world leaders, and above all, seeking to grab the attention of the world's media, helped no doubt by the start of the building of the Berlin Wall less than 3 weeks earlier. Although fewer countries took part than originally hoped for, 25 with 3 observers, the conference held symbolic importance, not least for its open letter to Kennedy and Khrushchev, urging the two to meet, delivered in person after the conference by Nero and Nkrumah to Khrushchev, and Sukarno and Modibo Keita, the president of Mali, to Kennedy. Even after the Cairo summit of 1964, the dates of which caused the UN to change the start of its General Assembly, Tito and others remained unconvinced of the need for regular summits, suggesting instead that the movement would organize around UN General Assemblies. Only from the third summit, held in Lusaka in Zambia in 1970, were the summits given numbers, and the idea of both a coordinator for 3 years and a coordination bureau was established. The Lusaka summit saw Tito engage in a huge diplomatic effort in the margins of the conference to convince other leaders that the movement had gained a new lease of life, even while others criticized the tiredness of the formula of letting each leader make a long speech. Having already seen off Indonesian attempts to make the movement more radical, he continued to press for what he called de-ideologization, worried that what I have termed Yugoslavia's liminal hegemony was under threat, firstly from Algeria and later from Cuba. The summit in the 70s, in Lusaka, Algiers, Colombo, and Havana, saw an increase in membership, with some 93 members attending the 1979 conference. As its membership grew, so did its potential strength and influence, particularly within the UN. Although, of course, at the same time, the sheer diversity of member states meant that consensus, and they were keen to encourage decision-making by consensus, became harder and harder to achieve. Other bodies, including the G77, formed as a direct result of the non-aligned movement. The Organization of African Unity, the Conference of Islamic States, and others competed for attention on the international stage, although the G77 and the non-aligned movement worked very closely together. Tito's hope that the European neutrals would join never materialized. In the 1970s, Yugoslavia itself was torn to some extent between its role in the non-aligned movement and its involvement in the Helsinki process and the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe that could be credited with East-West détente, while at the same time heightening divisions, I think, between the global north and the global south. Jürgen Dinkel, in his book, a PhD thesis, written up now as a book, is surely correct to argue that détente allowed the non-aligned movement to focus far more in the 1970s on economic questions. Peter Willits makes the same argument many years before, and issues of inequalities and underdevelopment as barriers to modernization. In the context of what we now understand as globalization, the ability of the North to control the terms of trade, and an issue raised throughout the decade by the Cubans, the power of multinational corporations. It ensured the UN became a platform for these questions, interlinked with the importance of decolonization and a condemnation of racism and apartheid. The attempt to maintain distance from both power blocs, however, meant that those countries advocating a stronger anti-capitalist stance, particularly led by Cuba, remained in a minority. In terms of global economic justice, NAM's focus in the context of the rise of globalized neoliberalism in the 1970s on global economic justice was not without its contradictions, not least in terms of seeking once again to balance what were perceived as radical and moderate voices within it. The third NAM summit, sorry if this is making you dizzy, the third NAM summit in Lusaka in 1970 noted, quotes, that the poverty of developing nations and their economic dependence on those in affluent circumstances constitute a structural weakness in the present world economic order, arguing that the persistence of an inequitable world economic system inherited from the colonial past and continued through present neocolonialism poses insurmountable difficulties in breaking the bondage of poverty and shackles of economic dependence. It urged the United Nations to employ international machinery to bring about a rapid transformation of the world economic system, particularly in the field of trade, finance, and technology, so that economic domination yields to economic cooperation and economic strength is used for the benefit of the world community. Now, at the same time, some Yugoslav commentators outlined a more moderate position, notably Leo Mates, who argued, and I think Cardell would strongly disagree with this, but it's an important argument. Mates suggested that, quotes, the gulf between the North and the South is not a conflict of antagonistic social forces, but rather a dispute between categories of countries having different immediate interests, but common long-term interests. The argument seemed to be for a scaling up of the Yugoslav miracle of industrialization, modernization of agriculture, export-led growth, and a focus on those goods whose price ratios in the market were more favorable to exporting nations. Twin-track developmentalism was the method of choice. Fairer trading relations for the majority of developing countries and grant aid for the least developed. A Yugoslav briefing paper written ahead of the Algiers summit in 1973 stated, as a socialist non-aligned developing country, Yugoslavia holds the position that the main responsibility for socio-economic development rests with the developing countries themselves. Pull yourselves up, guys. And their national efforts in terms of developmental goals. The oil price shocks of the early 1970s tested severely the unity of the movement. Tito was one of those who argued that oil-rich countries should invest in a fund to help the 25 least developed countries, albeit with one eye on Yugoslavia's own situation, calling for wider debt write-offs and special incentives for Yugoslav companies to trade with the least developed. Calls for, quotes, a liberalization of market relations, an emphasis on regionalization of trade, and priority to infrastructural projects with, quotes, great opportunities for short-term accumulation, also links socialist Yugoslavia's vision of an emerging international economic order with economic policies at home. Notwithstanding Yugoslav instrumentalism, the movement as a whole did manage to shift the global debate to an extent from oil to the price of all raw materials, as well as opening up issues of global finance, monetary policy, the role of multinational corporations, and access to scientific and technical innovation. And although this is extremely complicated, a kind of confluence between socialist and neoclassical globalization, as outlined by Joanna Bockman, was institutionalized to an extent in UNCTAD, the UN Economic Commission for Europe, and crucially in what became known as the new International Economic Order. This adhered to what Yuri Ramczak has described as an evolutionist and state-centered vision of development, itself the dominant model within the UN at the time, echoing the contradictions of contemporary debates about sustainable development. Visions of socio-economic justice, articulating forms of regulation, rights, and redistribution, prefigured a space that, whilst not fully global, was far more than merely regional. For all its faults, the creation of UNCTAD in 1964, under the leadership of Raoul Prebisch, was an important moment in the attempt to translate the political power of the non-aligned directly to the economic sphere, focusing on structural constraints that hindered development in the global south and promoting what Taylor and Smith have termed a mixture of Keynesianism and development and dependency theory. The West in particular was highly ambivalent towards UNCTAD, although it preferred it to greater influence from the Soviet bloc in the global south. They were able to effectively block many of its programs, so that soon it became known to insiders as UNCTAD under no circumstances take a decision. One might even argue that the dominance of heterodox economics, dependency theory, and so on within UNCTAD actually led to the strengthening of the international financial institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, as global hegemons. As UNCTAD failed to live up to expectations, the non-aligned pressed for a new international economic order alongside a new international information order, based on an understanding that economic independence necessitated changes to the global economic order, and that the terms of the new industrial and information revolutions were heavily biased in favor of the global south. But what you see is neoliberalism growing in the international financial institutions and a marginalization of the UN bodies. Throughout the 1970s, speech after speech at NAM meetings emphasized the need to turn words into action. At the same time, the way in which every problem was seen through a lens of development, and a series of NAM projects, such as the opening of a non-aligned development bank, all came to nothing, meant that NAM's global approach to economic justice lost out to regional trading blocs, to the IFIs, and to the WTO. Reforming the UN. It's now commonplace to assert that progressive economic and social policies, as well as peace building in an interconnected world, requires a fit-for-purpose system of global governance, and that the UN, as currently constituted, falls far short of that. We can see now attacks on the World Health Organization, but forgetting that it's been systematically underfunded and badly staffed for years. Tito's statement to Haile Selassie in the margins of the fourth summit in Lusaka in 1970, that half the UN is here, was somewhat premature. By the time of the Algiers summit 3 years later, 76 non-aligned states took part at a time when total UN membership was 135. As Amilcar Cabral phrased it as early as 1964 at a speech in Cairo at the summit, NAM worked for, quotes, the liberation of the UN and the radical reform and renewal of its structures in order to turn a giant with its hands tied into a body serving the noble causes of freedom, fraternity, progress, and happiness for mankind. The Lusaka statement from 1970 on the United Nations framed the issues with quite some clarity. Quotes, the conference is convinced that special attention should be paid to improving the capability of the United Nations to play an effective role in the economic and social fields. The participating countries urge that further efforts be made to ensure equitable geographical representation in the various organs of the United Nations, as well as in the specialized agency. So more attention to economic and social dimensions and greater equity in terms of representation in the UN and its bodies. NAM focused on the need for the UN to be universal and for its bodies to be representative, albeit at a time, as I've said, when the IFIs, lacking accountability, gained ever more importance. In the face of the veto powers of the Security Council, NAM advocated for an increase in the number of non-permanent members, an increase in the membership of ECOSOC, and greater power for both the General Assembly and ECOSOC in relation to the Security Council. The establishment of UNCTAD in '64, the greater role for UNIDO and UNESCO, the priority given to the principle of self-determination within the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, even the readmission of the People's Republic of China to the UN in 1971, can all be traced, I think, to the lobbying and bloc voting of now member states, who would coordinate their actions prior to UN General Assemblies. Chiara Bonfiglioli has also shown how the work of Yugoslav state-oriented feminists, such as Vida Tomšić, during the UN Decade for Women, 1975-1985, was a feature of linking progressive demands on women's rights with labour markets and social welfare. Yugoslavia, not least through its leadership of the non-aligned movement, came to punch above its weight in the United Nations, with Yugoslavia's techno-managerial class taking on a clear and early transnational dimension, both in terms of a long march into existing international organizations and securing key positions in new ones, as well as being a kind of global transnational technical class. Arno Truls has suggested that the role of Yugoslav legal experts in framing debates around international law within the UN shouldn't be underestimated. In that sense, the 70s was again a crucial decade. The Declaration on Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, passed by the UN General Assembly in 1970, the 1974 Charter on Economic Rights, and a series of resolutions on racial and gender equality owed a great deal to this Yugoslav legal influence. At the same time, Yugoslavia had very limited success in institutionalizing what Truls has termed a single human rights frame, combining civil, social, economic, and cultural rights, with many of the objections coming from the Global South. So to conclude, the study of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War helps to disrupt a dominant narrative that a bipolar world has been replaced by a multipolar world. Although the idea that a top-down constellation of neutralist nation-states has a monopoly on opposition to hegemonic threats to self-determination now appears rather outdated, the lessons of non-alignment can still inspire the emancipatory imaginaries of today. First and foremost, the framing of resistance to global disorder in terms of the importance of rebuilding, quotes, a loose worldwide network of internationalist and anti-imperialist movements, as we set out suggest, is one lesson from the heyday of the non-aligned movement to the present day. Finally, at the very least, the non-aligned movement reminds us of the importance of a multilateral international order based on commonly agreed rules, and of the need to rock the boat whenever the gap between the ideal and the reality becomes intolerable, as it kind of is now. In today's multi-superpower world, a restatement of politicized neutrality and of internationalist solidarities that question Northern and Western hegemony, as well as the imperial ambitions of China and the Russian Federation, but which are not based on misplaced claims to the superiority of Yugocentric concepts, traditions, and practices, is surely more important than ever. Combining the analysis here, focusing on Socialist Yugoslavia, with work more firmly rooted in the struggles of Africa, Asia, and Latin American countries, would at least serve to widen the horizons of aspiration and action, to quote David Hennig in a recent paper, and allow for a re-emphasis on the moment of non-alignment as a leitmotif for a different kind of multilateralism, and multilateralism otherwise. Thanks a lot for listening.